Hey guys, and welcome back to Monka, where something ensues, but yesterday I wrapped up, I guess, on a game, so to speak, and so I kind of want to talk about it because, that's just kind of what we do on this channel. But yesterday I wrapped up on RemiLore, Lost Girl in the Lands of Lore. I'm sorry, I always forget the subtitle because honestly it's too long, and for the sake of this video we're just going to call it RemiLore because all that other shit doesn't really matter. But the game was released in 2019 for PC via Steam, Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and as well as you can see the Nintendo Switch. It was developed by RemiLore and Pixelore, and it was published by Nicalis. Now, I've never ever heard of the developers, and probably you haven't either, because honestly, I've never heard of these developers develop any sort of game, and I don't think they've developed a game since this game. I might be wrong on that, but honestly, I've never heard of either of those two developers in my life. Nicalis are kind of known, I think they're kind of infamously known now, but they also had a hand in, I believe, publishing The Binding of Isaac. But in short, RemiLore is a roguelite action RPG with JRPG elements inflicted into it, mainly in the visuals and characters. But overall, RemiLore it's alright, I guess. I mean, it's an okay game at most, I would say. For what they charge, which is $40, I honestly cannot recommend it because it's not worth $40. I will say that it is kind of a decent introduction into roguelites for people who've never played a roguelite, or maybe people who like JRPGs but don't want to delve into like a hardcore roguelite. Honestly, this is a pretty easygoing roguelite to dive into, and so if you've ever been interested in roguelites, it's actually a pretty decent game. Not for full price though, I will say that. For $10 it'd be worth it, but for $40 it is way too shallow and doesn't have enough content to justify the price point, especially considering that other roguelites sometimes go for a lower price and have more content than this does. But some other details before we dive in. I completed 8 runs in total for this game, and in total played it for 15 hours. But in terms of the graphics and performance, like I said, the stylization is very much a kind of cartoony JRPG style of graphical design. I guess you could call it an anime aesthetic as well if you wanted to, but graphics look fine, to be honest. Like I usually say, it's not a point of contention for me where I really judge games, and on the Switch it looks just fine, so I'm fine with it. But the performance as well is pretty decent. It stays pretty consistent at 30 FPS. Sometimes when the screen starts to get a bit busy, it dips below 30, but that's not very often. It is an isometric action RPG, kind of like Diablo or whatever, so you would expect the performance to do just fine, and it does. So I am okay with the performance overall. Sometimes it goes above 30, sometimes it goes below 30, but for the most part it stays consistent at 30 FPS though. But overall, in terms of the graphics and performance, the graphics are fine. Like I said, they're more of a JRPG stylization, and the game runs fine as well, so I can't complain about that. But in terms of the music, voice acting, and sound design, the music is alright, honestly. None of these tracks I'm going to write home about, and to be honest, I don't have a lot of tracks to write home about anyways, because in total, I don't think this soundtrack is any bigger than 10 songs. These songs are alright, but to be honest, throughout 15 hours, you will consistently hear the same 10 songs over and over again, and honestly, they get kind of grating because there's just not a lot of variety in the music. The songs kind of get grating even if they are decent, which kind of sucks. I wish the soundtrack was a bit bigger because honestly that would have helped with the fact that these songs are just kind of painfully repetitive. But overall, the soundtrack is fine. In terms of the voice acting, in total there's 3 voice actors, and honestly they're all fine. Like I said, there's nothing really to write home about. They get kind of grating as well though, even if you are not playing the story mode and you're playing the single player mode, which is kind of like the story mode but just strips out all the story parts. The characters will still have dialogue throughout these stages, and honestly the dialogue just kind of gets grating and the voice acting gets kind of grating just through the fact that you consistently hear the same lines over and over. So the voice actors aren't bad, but the fact that they just consistently want to have dialogue and the dialogue is just grating, I don't know. It's fine voice acting, but it's another design choice where they just kind of make it grating after a while. But in terms of the sound design, the biggest point to talk about is the weapons and how they sound. Some weapons actually sound pretty good when you make contact with enemies. Things like swords and metal weapons and stuff like that actually have pretty satisfying sounds when you land hits on enemies. However, this game likes to go with some meme weapons like a spaghetti on a fork and shit like that, and marshmallows on a stick and shit like that. Those weapon designs are very unsatisfying when you land hits on enemies just because they have such an unsatisfying sound when you land a hit that just makes combat kind of unsatisfying, which kind of sucks because some of those weapons can be really strong, and so you have the metal weapons that have very satisfying sound design when you land hits hits on enemies. And then you have shit like spaghetti on a fork and marshmallows on a stick, which have an unsatisfying sound effect when you land hits on enemies. But overall, in terms of the music, voice acting, and sound design, the music is alright, but gets grating after a while due to the choice to use so few tracks throughout the game. The voice acting is fine, but gets grating over time because they consistently use voice acting throughout the game. And the weapon design fluctuates from being satisfying in the sounds of metal weapons and then unsatisfying in like the meme weapons that they use throughout the game. But in terms of the story and characters, I'm going to spoil the story rotten, so I apologize in advance, but it's not that deep of a story. But basically the story is that there is a girl named Remy who is just a schoolgirl who is cleaning up a library when she discovers a magical book called Lore. Now when she freaks out and discovers that the book is magical, can speak, Lore freaks out and teleports them back to his world known as Ragnarok. At that point the story starts out that Remy is trying to get to a portal with the Lore that will get her back to her world. Now throughout that story she is impeded by a character called Shu, who is creating the enemies known as mecha monsters that you will be fighting throughout the game. You'll consistently encounter Shu until you get to the portal where you fight her in a final battle and then eventually go back to your own world. Now the second part of the story is Shu pretty much learning that she fucked up, and you play as Shu pretty much going through the same levels and the same worlds and the same bosses, cleaning up after her mess. That is the entirety of the story mode summed up, and honestly it's a whatever story. At points it feels like it wants to be more than what it is, but since it's put into a roguelite, it can't be deeper than what it is because, you know, pre-Hades roguelites really didn't have deep stories, but it's a decent story, I guess. I only played through the story mode once, and then I played through the new game plus with Shu, and honestly after that I was just playing the single player mode because there's nothing really to talk about in this story. It just kind of connects the game together, and it's alright I guess, but it's nothing memorable. The characters as well, they're nothing really memorable. There's 3 in total, like I said: Remy, Lore, and Shu. Remy is just your typical high school girl. Lore is some magical book with a weird ego to him, and then Shu is kind of a masochistic android that for whatever reason one way or another wants to antagonize humans. But none of the characters are really memorable, and I won't really be writing home about any of them. But in terms of the stories and characters, the story's whatever I guess. It's nothing really memorable, and the characters are whatever I guess as well, and they're nothing really memorable. But in terms of the gameplay, like I mentioned, this is a roguelite isometric action RPG. The game is based around typical roguelite elements. Your run will consist of running through 4 acts, and at each act there is 4 levels. That consists of 3 levels where you're doing dungeon crawling, and the 4th level where you are fighting the boss of the area before you progress on to the next level. Each act always keeps the same design run to run, as in thematically. There is a random generation element to the levels, but it's really nothing crazy due to the fact that the level design is not really all that crazy. It's mainly you're either progressing through hallways, or either it's a small room or a big room, and really that's the level design overall. It's really nothing crazy, nothing memorable, and the real reason why I felt probably so burnt out after 15 hours, there's just not a lot of depth to the level design, and there's not a lot of creativity as well. It just kind of gets monotonous over time and just boring because there's just not a lot going on with the level design. But the enemies are kind of the same as well. There's nothing really crazy going on with the enemies. The enemies will stay the same run to run, and so honestly the problem with this game is, yes, a lot of roguelites are kind of repetitive, but this game is repetitive to a fault, honestly. It just, the enemies are just uninteresting in design, and most of them just don't do anything too crazy. You have projectile based enemies, and then you have melee based enemies, and then that's pretty much it overall. But the boss design as well is nothing too crazy. They can be challenging at first, but once you learn them after a few runs, they're really easy to deal with. But in terms of the actual experience of the game, the roguelite element of this game is pretty much you'll start with a set amount of HP and MP. You'll pretty much be progressing through levels, beating up enemies, and at the end of the level you'll have a chance to upgrade weapons and stuff like that. And as well, there's scrolls in the level which can potentially give you an MP HP buff or MP HP debuff. As well, at the end of the level you can swap out weapons potentially for one stronger. Weapons are based on rank in this game, so there's a D rank to an S rank, and pretty much your progression through the game will be that you'll be beating through enemies, collecting points from either destroying items in the area or picking up from enemies. You'll pretty much be progressing through the levels. Each level has a mini boss that you beat besides the main bosses for each act, and pretty much you'll just be progressing through the game, just beating the enemies up, collecting the points, unlocking new weapons, and of course playing the roulette with the scrolls until you beat the final boss, and then you of course complete the run. Then you restart the run and your HP and MP reset. However, you have an upgrades tab where you can spend your points to upgrade pretty minute details, stuff like increasing your odds of getting better weapons or increasing your spells, which we'll talk about when we get to combat. It's pretty shallow stuff, to be honest, and honestly the meta progression doesn't feel all that satisfying, but it does have roguelite elements. Like I said, it's run based. Your HP and MP and weapons reset every run. run, but you do have a meta progression where you can steadily make things easier and make yourself stronger. But the game is pretty forgiving as a roguelite though, mainly due to the fact that if you die in an act, you can just restart from the beginning of the act. Instead of having to restart the entire run, you can just restart from the beginning of the act. So if you die in like 3-4, say for example, you'll just restart at 3-1 instead of restarting all the way at 1-1. So it's a pretty forgiving for a roguelite. That's why I kind of said it was a good place to start for a new roguelite player, because honestly it's pretty forgiving for a roguelite. It's a good way to get your feet wet, but it's nothing amazing. And like I said, that roguelite element is really simple because there's just not a lot going on. There isn't an item shop or anything like that. Your progression throughout the run is based on just upgrading weapons and whether you get more or less HP and more or less MP. Besides that progression throughout a run, there really just isn't a lot going on throughout the runs. So it's pretty shallow for a roguelite, to be honest. And on the action RPG side, it's pretty shallow as well. Now the controls feel pretty tight, to be honest, and I can appreciate that. It's nice to know that when you die, it's not the fault of the game. It's just the fault of the fact that you just messed up and so you died because you messed up. That's a good thing in terms of the controls because it feels like the death is on you rather than on the game fucking up somehow. But it plays pretty simple for an action RPG. You'll pretty much just be going room to room beating up enemies, and pretty much when you clear a room, you're just going on to the next room and beating up more enemies, occasionally taking a detour to see if you can unlock a better weapon or something like that. But the action RPG side of the game is pretty shallow as well, which is unfortunate because ultimately what you come up with is a roguelite which is shallow in its roguelite elements and an ARPG which is shallow in its ARPG elements. But some points of contention for the game are the fact that you have something called desert points, which I've been referring to as points throughout the game, which you pretty much collect that allows you to obtain your meta progression via the upgrades, and as well you can buy these scrolls, health potions, and as well potentially new weapons. The problem with these points is that they carry over run to run, so it feels like at some point the points kind of become trivial because you get so many points throughout a run that once you spend them all on upgrades, they're kind of trivial because all you're doing is just buying weapons and health potions, and there's never any risk to it because you have enough money because it carries over run to run that, oh, I can potentially get a weapon upgrade for 1,000 points and I have 100,000 points that carried over from my previous run. There's just no risk there really, and that's kind of disappointing because that's one of the points of a roguelite, is that there's kind of the risk reward of, oh, I spend this much money but I might just lose it on something pointless. Well, in this game there's not a lot of risk because you just get so many of those points that you can just buy a lot of shit, and the risk reward part of this game just kind of feels trivial because you can either lose HP or gain HP, or you can lose MP or gain MP via the scrolls, or you can lose your weapon or whatever. It feels kind of trivial and it's all luck based, and honestly the roguelite element of this game is very heavily luck based, which is kind of disappointing, but some people probably like that. But honestly the whole luck based shit, I just don't really get down with it. But something to mention about the ARPG side of the game as well is that there's 6 weapons in total that you unlock throughout runs. I think it takes a total of 4 runs to unlock all the weapon types. There's 2 light weapons, 2 medium weapons, and 2 heavy weapons. Pretty much what that means is the 2 varieties of light weapons attack fast but have light damage, the moderate weapons have moderate attack and moderate damage, and the heavy weapons have heavy attack but slow attack speed. Honestly, the only weapon class worth using is the medium because it just feels so balanced, but the heavy weapons are way too slow to use in this game, so I found myself like never using them just because I was moving way too slow while the enemies were moving way too fast. And the light weapons are fine, but they just don't do enough damage to really justify them, so most of the time I found myself using the moderate weapons because they just have a moderate attack, moderate speed of attack, and they just work out the best in general. But there's a total of 200 weapons in the game, 215 or 213 I believe, and honestly while that sounds like a lot, it's just kind of trivial because a lot of the weapons kind of just do the same thing, they just have minor stat differences. But as well in terms of the gameplay, the ARPG side is pretty shallow because all you have is a light attack, a heavy attack, and then you have a dash as well as a spell, and that's pretty much your entire move set, and it's pretty basic, and like I said, it's pretty shallow. Now the spells are something that makes the game kind of weird because you can either be underpowered with a spell or you can be massively overpowered with a spell. There's some spells that do jack shit, like they just wipe all the bullets from ranged enemies attacks, or you can get something like a tornado that absolutely wipes out every enemy in the area, and it's absolutely ridiculous. But the spell balance is just weird, to be honest, because some spells are so useless that you'll never want to use them, and some spells are so overpowered that that's all you want throughout the entire run. Like, projectile-based spells are just incredibly overpowered. Like I said, the tornado one just wipes every enemy out on the map. There's also one that shoots homing bullets, which is just overpowered, especially on bosses. And there's one where Lore will just spin around in a circle, just firing bullets everywhere, and that one is massively overpowered as well. Like I said, really useful on bosses. But the spell balance is kind of weird, just because at points it breaks the game to the point where it's like, it makes runs trivial. Using a tornado spell, I think I completed a run in less than an hour. Most runs at that point were taking like an hour 15. But the runs in total, when you start out, they probably take around 2.5 hours. You'll probably end up finding yourself somewhere in the range of an hour to an hour and a half for every run once you get good at the game. But you will be dying a lot early on just because you don't know the mechanics of the game. But once you get settled in, it becomes pretty easy and you won't be dying all that often, if at all. But another thing worth mentioning in terms of the gameplay is that the meta progression honestly isn't all that satisfying. It's probably one of the multiple reasons why I just stopped playing the game. The meta progression just isn't all that satisfying, honestly. Yeah, sure, there is a form of meta progression in the fact that you will be gaining more upgrades throughout the game, and then you can also unlock more types of weapons, but it really just feels kind of shallow, and honestly it's just unsatisfying. Now, the only other thing worth mentioning is the fact that there's quite a few game modes, and there's also a couple characters you can pick from. There's two sides of the story mode. You can either play as Remy on your first run, and then there's a new game plus where you'll play as Shu. And the characters do have two different types of stats. Mainly in the HP MP department, they don't really have different stats anywhere else, but Remy goes for more of a balanced HP MP stat, starting out with 1000 health and 100 MP, while Shu is more of a tank that has 1300 HP and 70 MP. After playing both of them for a run, every subsequent run I played as Shu because the health buff is just way more useful than having balanced MP. But as well, when you beat the story mode with Remy, you open up a lot of game modes. There is a single player mode where you can strip out the story part of the game, which I played the most of, but there's also a ton of different challenge modes, like a hard mode or a 1 HP mode or a permadeath mode. There's a lot of modes in the game, but honestly they don't feel all that worth playing just because the game's just kind of shallow. Once you complete the meta progression in terms of the upgrades, the game just kind of becomes boring. But in terms of the gameplay, honestly the best way to describe it is I feel like it's shallow in terms of roguelite and it's shallow in terms of ARPG. But overall, my opinion on RemiLore is that at full price, $40, it is not worth it, honestly. This game is just kind of really too simple and too shallow to justify such a high price point. It's not a terrible game, like I said, but it's just such a meta game, honestly, that for $40, I can't really recommend it. If you can find it for $10, I think it would be worth maybe 10 hours of your time. Honestly, after 15, I was terribly bored of this game. I just wanted to move on at that point, but it's a decent game overall, honestly. I think this would be a good introduction to roguelites for a JRPG fan. If you're kind of intimidated by roguelites and the kind of like hardcore nature of them that they usually embody, this game is a lot more easygoing than your typical roguelite, and it'd probably be a good diving point into roguelites, to be honest, just because of how simple it is. Now, that being said, the big drawback of this game is that it's so simple and that it feels so shallow that in comparison to other roguelites, it just doesn't carry its weight. And like I said, in terms of an ARPG as well, it feels pretty shallow, but I can't really in good faith recommend this game, honestly. I can recommend it if you can find it at a steep discount and are interested in roguelites but don't want like the full roguelite experience, but otherwise you can honestly skip on this game. But thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I'll see you. Stay chill.